And we're back with Shades of Green on KDWN 720. I'm your host, Paul Ira, and we're speaking with Annette Bubeck from Green Alliance and Stan Hannell from Drive Clean Energy. Before the break, we were talking a little bit about gasoline and its beginnings. And there's a series on Netflix about the men who built America. And one of them is about John D. Rockefeller, who ultimately started Standard Oil. And back in the late 1800s, when they were replacing whale oil for oil lamps, they came up with this petroleum-based product called kerosene. And one day I was visiting the plant, and they saw him throwing away this liquid, and they said, what is that liquid you're throwing away? And they said, well, it's a byproduct of making kerosene. And they said, well, what do you call it? He said, well, we call it gasoline. And that was kind of the beginning of gasoline and the internal combustion engine using that fuel to run with. And that takes us into the fight between internal combustion engines and electric engines. And tell us some more, Stan. How come we didn't always drive electric cars?
Right, yeah. Around the turn of the century, you actually had competition between steam, electric, and gasoline-powered electric cars. So as we talked about, I think the utility of Henry Ford's Model T was that it could burn almost anything. You could adjust the carburetor and basically the combustion timing and all that. So you could burn not just before there was gasoline. People could had stills on the family farm, so you could basically have alcohol, methane, different, I guess, ethyl alcohol, things that could be distilled out of farm products. Hemp was a big product back in the day before it kind of got outlawed, but they could distill alcohol out of that really easily. So that was used on a lot of the farms in the rural areas. So the electric cars were kind of confined to the urban areas where there already was existing electricity from lighting systems and all. But even that we didn't have a nationwide grid at that point, and there wasn't really any gasoline distribution centers until later when Standard Oil really did push for it, and the independence of the Model T and the low cost. It cost about 1/3 the cost of a custom-built electric car to get a Model T. So it became something that everybody could afford, and it was adaptable. You could turn it into a truck. You could do just all sorts of different things with it. So, but Edison and Ford did look at collaborating. They just never got around to it, I guess, because of the success of the Model T. They stayed with that. And,
so part of the issue was mass production,
right.
And Ford's coming up with mass production, and the fact that we didn't have an infrastructure to recharge the electric vehicles,
right,
other than in the city. And like you said, we didn't have a universal grid out there back in those days. So it sort of died on its own.
Right, and same with steam at the time too. Steam power was very potent. You could, just water-based basically, and some kind of fuel to heat the boiler. But basically,
didn't the Beverly Hillbillies have a steam-powered car?
No, I don't think so. They were an Okie from Muskogee. They had an old truck. I think that was like a Model A or Model T truck that they drove in on. But yeah, no, it was fun. But so basically, over time, we saw several waves to try and bring back electric. The big one was in the 1990s. When use electronics, and GM was looking at modern technologies, how to usher in new technologies to change the industry. So they actually came out with what they call the impact at the time, and as they showed, with electric motors, you have electromagnetic torque, the ability to come up with, right off the line, come up with the power that you need. So in a way, electric motors are much more superior to internal combustion engines. But gasoline has much greater power density than stored battery power.
So speaking of those electric cars and how much power they have, what's this thing called Wicked Watts?
Right, yeah. So that was something we tried to do in the 90s. So during that 90s period, a lot of people got back and got interested in it. There's a group called the Electric Auto Association. Locally, we have a chapter called the Las Vegas Electric Vehicle Association, one of 60 chapters across the country. But during the 1970s, we had an OPEC oil embargo of the country. Basically, there was a 6-day war, and some of the nations from the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries decided that they would punish the U.S. by cutting back shipments to the country. So there was a real interest in that. Out here in Las Vegas, from 1979 to 1982, a couple people from the Nevada test site started up Electro-Motors on Valley View Boulevard, and they were produced about 1,000 vehicles during that time. Before I think the 1980s came along, and then oil came back down in price. So and then in the 90s, we saw a surge. GM introduced the EV1. And it had a lot of breakthrough technologies. Hughes Corporation came up with a really nice controller that could actually make it easier to control an electric motor. And so that electromagnetic torque, it showed a lot of promise, but it was costly. There were small runs of production. The EV1 wasn't really sold. It was leased to people on a trial basis. And then what happened is GM started getting into financial problems that later resulted in his bankruptcy in 2000, and they thought they needed to switch to selling big cars at greater profit margin in order to stay solvent. So they killed the program. During the 2000s, and we saw much more emphasis by the automotive companies to push Humvees and big cars, SUVs and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, by going down that route, when we had in 2008, when the cost of gasoline spiked to $4 a gallon, then all of a sudden GM got in trouble, and there was also the financial crisis. They had become more of a loan agency at that point. A lot of the corporations, because Glass-Steagall had been curtailed, tried to become more financial institutions, and so they all got hit really hard with the recession. Same with GE and a lot of other companies. So GM went close to bankruptcy. It took government intervention to turn the company around. Ford almost went into bankruptcy. They survived just barely, and then Chrysler got sold out to Fiat. So, by not staying with the technology that was basically leading edge technology, Japan basically followed up, and seeing the U.S. was going that direction, came out emphasized the hybrid model, and so the Toyota brought out the Prius when a lot of people said, "What do you need an electric motor for?" And
there were a lot of changes in the automotive industry in those times, but one thing that never changed is people always want to race.
That's right.
So there's a lot of hot rods and racing going on now with the electric cars. I understand they're actually a part of NHRA. So tell us about NEDR.
Yeah, it's a great story. A lot of folks just in their garage during the 1990s playing around with hot rodding and seeing that there were electric car technologies, new batteries, and it really became a wave. So the National Electric Drag Racing Association was formed just by a bunch of people getting together down at their local track and seeing how far they could push the technology. And back then they were using lead-acid batteries, but these new lithium-ion nickel metal hydride batteries were coming out as part of the GM EV1 program. That was a U.S. battery consortium that came up with new technology. And then lithium-ion had just been discovered around the 1990s. So they challenged gasoline cars head-to-head. We sponsored some local, through our LVEVA chapter, Las Vegas Electric Vehicle Associations, we called Wicked Watts, and we would get down to the quarter-mile track here at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway, and we would race on top of open events. So anybody could come down to the track on certain open days and compete.
Well, thanks, Stan. And I want to go back and let everybody know that greenfestlv.com, everything you ever wanted to know about Greenfest. And if you've missed any of our shows and you just can't wait to hear them, go to shadesofgreenradioshow.com and you can listen to past shows. I want to thank everybody for listening to Shades of Green on KDWN. And everybody have a great week and keep it green. And this is your host, Paul Ira. See you next week.